Hi, everyone. This week's Autism Science News was dominated by the release of the full special issue of Molecular Autism dedicated to studying sex differences in females with autism. I talked a little bit about some of these articles on a previous podcast, so I'm not going to rehash it, but I do want to highlight that a group of investigators who contributed to the Sex and Gender Differences meeting last October got together and put together their thoughts from that meeting, including future directions on where to go. It was published in this issue as a viewpoint. After the meeting was over in October, I did sit down and present a podcast, but read the article. This is really a more thoughtful and comprehensive summary with other people's opinions added in. That's, of course, always a good thing. So what did the group, which included women with autism, think was important at the meeting? First were clinical guidelines or recommendations for clinicians about symptoms seen in males and females. Also, of course, examination of early signs and symptoms, but following girls and boys with autism across their lifespan. We also wanted to make sure that in animal models, data from both male and females were included. Usually, believe it or not, it's mostly male mice or rats that are studied. And also to that point, there needs to continue to be basic science focused on human sexual dimorphism, or just the basic differences between boys and girls. And finally, it's important to make sure that when you look at girls with autism, it's important to compare them to girls without autism, not just boys with autism. So to highlight that point, to understand girls with autism, you have to understand girls without autism. That was done in a study out of John Fox's group and Albert Einstein in New York this week. They studied boys and girls with autism and compared them to boys and girls without autism to better understand if the differences are part of a continuum of sex differences between males and females in general. So what they did is look at the ability of boys and girls with and without autism to distinguish different sounds in the presence of visual information, specifically whether these kids could distinguish between different words if they were presented with different visual cues and different background noises. The biggest finding was that there was a difference between boys and girls with autism, but not boys and girls without autism. In other words, they show that multisensory speech processing is less affected in autism girls than boys, which may explain some of the symptom presentation. But these findings were only evident when you included boys and girls without autism into the analysis. Another study that reinforces this point comes from brain tissue research. So yes, this is going to be another podcast about the sex difference in autism. This one looked at a protective mechanism, or a potential protective mechanism, a gene called RORA. RORA stands for retinoic acid-related orphan alpha receptor. The activity of this gene responds to hormones, and because hormones and sex hormones are important for brain development, the idea was that RORA could be the link between sex, brain development, and autism, and that disruption of RORA in people with autism may affect the sex bias. The authors group, Dr. Valerie Hu and her students at George Washington University, has published on RORA previously. They theorized that it could be involved in a difference in prevalence between males and females. This particular study expanded what was known about RORA in autism by using postmortem brain tissue and testing them further in an animal model. The findings suggest that RORA is highest in females without autism, and that a deficiency in RORA may be more detrimental in boys compared to girls. Also, RORA affects transcription of other genes differently in males and females. And since RORA influences gene expression of autism-related genes like neuroligin, this could, and I mean could, be one of the explanations for the female bias. And to remind you, another paper published in this special issue demonstrated that there is no one female protective gene. There are likely to be many. So this study is interesting, but pretty speculative. So I'm not telling you about this study because the findings were not completely solid, that they were considered suggestive, or they are somewhat speculative. But I am telling you about it because unless there is more brain tissue to study, this sort of research will never be conclusive. That's why if you have autism, or if you have a family member with autism, you have to register with the Autism BrainNet. These very exciting but very suggestive findings will never move further without more definitive sample numbers. Without studying the brains of people with autism, autism researchers will never understand autism. So if you haven't already, please go to takesbrains.org. Thank you again for listening to this sex difference heavy podcast. Next week, I'll be talking about a meeting I'm attending in Washington, D.C., which is focusing on environmental exposures and neurodevelopmental disorders. Talk to you then.